Chapter 2. The Prefrontal Cortex. The human being is a completely particular, singular, unique being, not so much for its anatomy, nor for its bipedal attribute, nor even so much for its intellectual capacities, but for one of its extremely specific, complex, and sophisticated organs. Indeed, just 4 elements, namely oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen, constitute more than 96% of the human body. So the human anatomy is not anything notably spectacular, quite the contrary even, since they are the most simple and elementary elements present everywhere in the world and the universe. Likewise, other living organisms present in nature move on 2 lower limbs, so that the bipedal attribute is also not something that remarkable in itself, even more so when we confront with the fact that many animals are much stronger and faster and much more skillful and agile on their 4 limbs than humans are on their 2 legs. Bipedal argument, yet so much for so long put forward by all supporters of the evolutionary hypothesis as the supposed final stage of what they call evolution. Moreover, so many other living organisms are intelligent, such that the intellectual abilities of the human being are not a criterion of superiority over other living organisms. The brain is, in fact, what makes it so special and differentiates it from all other living organisms known to date. However, what makes the human brain exceptional? What truly and definitively makes the enormous difference between human beings and animals? What ultimately demonstrates the fact that human beings are first and foremost moral and spiritual beings? A clear answer to these questions can only be provided on the basis of good sense, and one example in particular, unique in its kind, leads to an unequivocal conclusion on the matter. An event that occurred in the United States of America on September 13, 1848, shed new light in the context of medicine linked to the mechanisms that operate in the frontal part of the brain and what the latter is primarily used for. Indeed, while working as a railroad foreman digging rock to lay rails, a man named Phineas Gage suffered a severe head injury that dramatically changed his life. In fact, a metal bar which he used as a tamper to pack the sand on top of the dynamite, which itself was inserted at the bottom of a hole dug in the rock, was thrown towards his face as a result of a sudden explosion, and it perforated the cheekbone under the left eye, the front lobe of the brain, the frontal bone, and finally came out through the top of the skull. To the amazement of everyone present, he did not die. He was just severely injured, and luckily it did not become infected. He was in treatment for 3 weeks, and after this time, he returned to work. Before this accident, and according to the testimonies of people who knew him, Phineas Gage was very appreciated because of his seriousness and his viability at work. He was also a man very respectful of himself and others, a moral and religious person, a very loving husband and father. But unfortunately, when he returned to work and was in contact with his family and loved ones, he was no longer that same man, but a completely different person. Indeed, of the good, intelligent, virtuous man, the husband, father, friend, colleague, faithful, loving, and trustworthy, and the hardworking, patient, diligent, orderly, and conciliatory worker that he was, there remained nothing more. He had become mean, inconsistent, and villainous, vulgar, disgusting, and neglected, as well as the worst worker. Lazy, impatient, messy, disorderly, and brawling, and unfortunately bestial, angry, and tyrannical, even mistreating his wife and children, so much so that he very quickly lost his job, left his family, joined a traveling circus, and after 13 years following the accident, he finally died of epilepsy in the most total, complete ignorance. Medical research has established cerebral trauma to the front part of the brain, the said frontal lobe or prefrontal cortex, and on the basis of the flagrant change in character that took place in him, going from a stable, friendly, sociable man, hardworking, elegant, sober, to an unstable, unsympathetic, antisocial, slacker, filthy, drunkard individual, so the complete opposite of what he was. The logical conclusion is that the prefrontal cortex is the seat of something truly extremely important, namely the center of reason, logic, morality, and spirituality, or in this case, the center of discernment, analysis, judgment, and consciousness. However, it is not necessary for an iron bar to pierce our brain for our character to change in a significantly negative way, like the case of Phineas Gage. Indeed, the frontal lobe can be damaged in many different ways, for example, by indulging in the most unbridled hedonism, by listening to music with irritating, unpleasant, Mephistophelian sounds that are seriously and profoundly unbearable to the ear, by listening to songs with lyrics that are more than mediocre, vulgar, offensive, acerbic, obscene, and violent, just like watching unhealthy, perverse, and destructive videos, by wasting an inordinate amount of time playing time-consuming digital games, but also by more than passionate, obsessive, even more like sickly, following of competitive sports that are ultra-violence and corrupted by money, or even to their participation, by dumbing down oneself by fashion, reality TV, and poor use of the internet, by frequenting places of disrepute and debauchery in the nightlife where the most perverse and dangerous individuals roam and enforce their laws, just as much by consuming unhealthy and refined food, by abandoning oneself to pseudo-enjoyment and relaxation in the intoxication of alcohol, drugs, and tobacco, or even among others, by enclosing oneself in the religious and sectarian fanaticism of the most degenerate, mindless, brainless, and backward, of the most primitive, archaic, barbaric, and savage, of the most aggressive, violent, bloodthirsty, and deadly, or even of the most inhuman, monstrous, detestable, and irrecoverable, and therefore de facto, and at the same time the furthest from a healthy spirituality worthy of the name. Consequently, as soon as an individual practices activities that damage him the prefrontal cortex, whether these are the most banal activities or others that are infinitely more serious, his character is seriously and permanently altered, thus making one susceptible to being unpleasant, derogatory, unsympathetic, parasitic, harmful, toxic, malevolent, and mischievous, sowing vice, destruction, and evil around one. On the other hand, the brain can regenerate, as is the case for any organ of the human body, but obviously if the individual, in his or her individuality, begins to assimilate what is truly the most important in the world, and that it is one's duty to work on the development and strengthening of one's own character, with the aim of making the best decisions and implementing the necessary actions for the regeneration of one's body and, therefore, good mental and physical health in the long term. This involves an awareness that the prefrontal cortex is of fundamental importance and that there is nothing more important than life, than absolute truth, than universal harmony, than inner peace, than the health of the soul, the mind, and the body, that there is nothing more important than the universal moral values, than the moral sense, than the universal moral law, than the universal spiritual virtues, than the spiritual sense, than the universal spiritual law, than the universal moral and spiritual principles, just as it is inseparable to exclude all the poisons of the modern world, whether on the physical, material, or psychic level, but also, at the same time, to introduce healthy and good lifestyle habits on a daily basis, by changing one's way of thinking, one's way of doing and expressing, so one's lifestyle, and therefore one's behavior. The human brain is indeed a very particular and unique manifestation of its kind, anchored both in the material and immaterial world, therefore materialized by tangible matter in the physical world in the form of an organic cerebral mass, but also linked in an unknowable way to the immaterial world on the psychic, intellectual, spiritual level, through consciousness, thought, spirit, and psychosensitive senses at the origin of affect, feelings, emotions, intelligence, knowledge, creativity, the capacity for reflection, judgment, and imagination among others, which materialize in facts through speech and actions by means of its physical component and, as an extension, the rest of the body. Other living organisms in the world similarly have brains, but there is a fundamental difference that makes the human brain function in a radically different way from the brains of other living organisms, and that makes its determination, its finality, its goal, is particular and different from the rest of the world of the living, known to this day and scientifically verified, incontestable, and well-founded on the factual and material level. Indeed, the human brain is clearly differentiated from the animal brain by a more developed frontal lobe. For comparison, the frontal lobe of the cat only represents about 3.5% of the mass of the brain, and this is why the latter is extremely difficult to domesticate, unlike the dog whose frontal lobe represents approximately 7% of the brain mass, making it much easier to domesticate. The chimpanzee has, for its part and proportionally speaking, the largest frontal lobe of the entire animal kingdom, its volume in fact representing approximately 17% of the brain mass. But this nevertheless remains far removed from the percentage relative to human, which represents 33 to 38% of the brain mass. Animals, of course, have certain other brain centers that are more developed than humans. Chimpanzees, for example, have a more developed coordination center because they have by far a larger cerebellum, or little brain, which is responsible for an excellent sense of balance and dexterity, and therefore thanks to which they are very agile when they move through the trees. On the other hand, some birds have, in addition to a developed cerebellum, also a very advanced vision center, since they have a well-developed occipital lobe, such as the falcon, for example, renowned for its exceptional vision. However, unlike animals, humans do have a significantly larger frontal lobe, which implies that the latter have more developed capacities for reasoning, synthesis, judgment, and sensitivity and receptivity to very specific and ultra-complex metacognitive and metaphysical manifestations, and facilities for learning and expressing feelings and intentions that are far superior to the former, since with the now very famous case of Phineas Gage, it is scientifically proven, through good sense, that the frontal lobe is the center of reason, logic, morality, and spirituality, just like the center of intelligence, will, and motivation, among others. The logical conclusion is that the left and right hemispheres of the prefrontal cortex form the so-called higher cerebral structures, and that they are irremediably linked to the universal moral law, and that on the other hand, the other cerebral lobes, namely the occipital, temporal, and parietal lobes, and the cerebellum, form the so-called lower cerebral structures, and are linked to instinct. So, humans differ enormously from all animals precisely because they have more so-called higher brain structures. The prefrontal cortex controls, in fact, some of the most complex attractions, such as voluntary motor coordination and language, decision-making and creativity, memory and reflection. Conventional medicine does not go beyond what it cannot prove factually, materially, of course in a well-understood manner both for comfort and by interest. And this is indeed its limit because it is constantly in the demand, the search, or the expectation of factual, material proof, except that in science, certain things would remain an eternal mystery if the explanation and conclusions through good sense, therefore through reason and applied logic, are rejected promptly, out of hand. On the basis of the Phineas Gage case, and more than anything on the basis of good sense, it can be demonstrated and clearly admitted that sensitivity and receptivity to everything that is of a psychic order, therefore conceptual, intellectual, existential, or spiritual, takes effect in the frontal lobe, and that, therefore, the latter is clearly the most important part of the human brain. The one that allows us extreme sensitivity and receptivity to what is of a higher order and ultra-complex, in this case to reason, logic, morality, and spirituality, therefore to the notion of subtlety and relativity, finesse and sophistication, as well as pure and implex intelligence, both intrapersonal as well as interpersonal, as much linguistic as existential, since an individual free from these attractions is in fact nothing more than a problematic and destructive bipedal organic mass. Only a prefrontal cortex, sensitive and receptive to certain frequencies on the psychic field, allows the manifestation of a good character, thus structuring the individual intellectually on one side, thanks to the sense of reason and that of logic, and filling the latter existentially on the other, thanks to the sense of morality and that of spirituality, thus allowing him to be able to evaluate what makes sense and what is insane, what is good and what is bad, etc. Analogously, the human brain is the most sophisticated computer, which no human invention will ever equal or surpass, thanks to its immense natural processor, in this case the frontal lobe, because moral judgment, free will, sensitivity, isn't and will never be imitated by technology, as sophisticated as it is and as it becomes. On the other hand, the fact of not using, mobilizing, stimulating the frontal lobe, the human being does not take advantage of all his exceptional potential and all that he has to receive and give in life, therefore of everything that would satisfy him and make him happy substantially and fundamentally.